D-Day Oral History by Jerry W. Eades. This is the way that I remember the things that happened on the morning of June the 6th, 1944. To start with, I was born in Dallas, Texas on September 8, 1918. On September 13, 1936, just a few days after my 18th birthday, I joined the U.S. Army and was sent to Fort Bliss, Texas as cavalry unassigned. Upon arriving at Fort Bliss on the 16th of September 1936, I was met at the end of the streetcar line by a sergeant from the 82nd Field Artillery Regiment. And this is a unit that I take my recruit drill in, and consequently I wound up in D Battery, or Dog Battery as we called it, of the 82nd Field Artillery, which was a horse artillery. The difference between horse artillery and horse-drawn artillery is that horse artillery, everybody rides a horse, the cannoneers, gunners, everybody, and they are assigned to a cavalry division. The horse-drawn artillery, only the drivers and the chief of section rode horses. Everybody else either rode the gun limbers or the case limbers and caissons and were assigned to an infantry division. I was trained as an artilleryman or gunner, and of course from then till early in April of 1942 I did various jobs in the field artillery, and I was most of the time being a bugler. I re-enlisted in 1939 in a cavalry regiment, and after some 8 months I transferred back to the artillery. I attended the field artillery school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1941, the horse equitation class. And before I could even get back to Fort Bliss, I was told to go to the communication school at Fort Sill in 1941 and did another 3 months over there. To get myself out of a horse outfit, which I was getting kind of tired of, there was a new battalion organized called the 62nd Field Artillery Battalion, and its men were cadred from the 61st and 82nd Field Artilleries, and I saw the opportunity to transfer to this unit on April 10, 1942, and left for California with them. I thought maybe they would be going to the Pacific, but it turned out that they doubled back and went the other way and went on the invasion of North Africa. From there, it was a number of stops. After the African campaign, and I might say at this point, we got some very valuable training in the art of being armored artillery, because we worked with the famous 1st Infantry Division and were assigned to them quite a number of times. We went on after the African campaign to the invasion of the island of Sicily and fought the entire 38 days in that campaign. When in October of 1943 we were loaded on the boats to be transported over to Italy, and after some 6 hours of waiting on the boats, we were taken off the landing barges and sent into a staging area, where early the next morning we were loaded onto a British motor transport ship and consequently wound up debarking in Glasgow, Scotland some 34 days later, I believe it was, and then came to rest for a few months down in Banbury, England, near Oxford in the Midlands. On the 1st of April, or the end of March I think it was, we were transferred to the Salisbury Plains down around Dorchester and along the coast, and drew new equipment and began to prepare for the invasion. I was a sergeant, a chief of section in gun section number 4 of B Battery of the 62nd Armored Field Artillery Battalion. The enlisted men felt all along that there was going to be an invasion, and we certainly knew we were going to Europe, or the continent of Europe, eventually. But as far as the plans, we hadn't really been briefed on exactly what was going on, until the last few days before we begin to load on the transports or their landing barges. The camp down on the Salisbury Plains was called Piddlehinton Number 12, which is now called Bovington Camp by the British, and it is the British Army's Armored Center and Armored Museum. We trained going out on the water on a Navy boat called a LCT, which was landing craft tanks. They would load 2 of our 105 millimeter self-propelled artillery howitzers on this boat, and we would practice going so fast, and the executive officer or officer in charge would stand with a stopwatch, and where we could see him in the back of the guns, and he had a thing like a small wash tub or a large dish pan tied to a string or a wooden spoon or wooden paddle, and each time the boat would go so many yards by his stopwatch, he would wrap this dish pan with a gong, and we would fire 1 round, and immediately the gunner would change his settings to lower the range 50 yards, and the crew would reload the gun, and we would wait until the boat had traveled another 50 yards in so many seconds, and we would repeat the operation of firing the howitzer. We practiced this with the 3rd Battalion of the 16th Infantry Regiment and did quite a number of mock invasions along the Slapton Sands area. We were in the little fracas one evening, or late one night, when the U-boats got in among the follow-up troops. It's lucky that we were about 2 hours ahead of the follow-up troops, and a number of our and it sunk a number of the so-called invasion barges, and luckily none of our guns were sunk. We came out of it in pretty good shape, but it did make a dent in their little fracas that we were having, and it got everyone to thinking about this may be the real thing. I'm an American. I was with an American unit, and we came up to the United Kingdom in late 1943 in December from the island of Sicily, where we had been previously fighting, and there and into the all through the African campaign. Now, on the first 5 days of June, as I recall, we left Camp Piddlehinton, and we had spent the previous days waterproofing our vehicles, and only the drivers of the vehicles that were actually going to be loaded onto the landing barges were sent down to the marshalling area or to the dock area. The rest of the gun crew and other personnel were trucked up to another marshalling area some miles away from the actual dock area. I can't recall just what the number or names of these places were. We changed so frequently. Eventually, about the 2nd or 3rd, we went down to the dock area and loaded onto the LCTs that held our equipment. I don't think that this was the correct number of the Navy ship, but just for the invasion purposes, for the number of the convoy number, the LCT that I was on was number 1049, and the reason I remember that number so well, it was the last 4 digits of my Army serial number, which was 6271049. There we began to store our gear and get things ready for what was actually going to be the invasion, or what we thought so anyway. I believe it was on the 4th, the evening of the 4th, that we pulled out of Weymouth Harbor in Weymouth, England. And I remember the sun was shining, and there was a few people in swimming on the beach, although it was extremely cold, or what I thought was extremely cold. But being from a warm climate like Texas and just coming out of the desert and the island of Sicily, we were naturally acclimatized for warm weather. So June in England was quite cold to us. I thought going out of the harbor, and we had, and looking at the people who we had gotten out our field glasses, and naturally we were looking at all the girls on the beach. And I was thinking to myself at that time that it would be extremely cold to be out there swimming. But nevertheless, we pulled on out of the harbor and began to form up in a type of convoy. Some of the boats had big barge balloons tied to the top of them. Along about dark time, we were still inside the land, and the convoy was moving kind of slow. Then all of a sudden, it seemed like the stars came out, and we were in the dark running along. And the waves and water began to get extremely choppy, and the boat began to rock quite heavily, and some of the men began to get sick. So far as I know, that night we had K rations, the best I can remember. Wasn't anyone really too hungry, and K rations were not exactly inviting for supper on a rough sea. So anyway, we made do with what we had, and were quite miserable. The water was coming over the sides of the ship, and we were getting wet, and it was getting extremely cold. But sometime during the night, I was probably catnapping on the gun itself. It was a M4 tank with a turret removed and a 105 millimeter howitzer mounted in it with room for the gun crew to maneuver around and do their operations. This was called an M7 105 millimeter self-propelled howitzer gun. Then all of a sudden we found ourselves turning around and going back. Of course, we didn't know what was going on, but certainly the people in charge did. And anyway, just before daylight, we came back into the Weymouth Harbor at Weymouth, England. Everybody was beginning to curse and to raise Cain about another dry run. But here they had wasted another day, but we had lots of days to waste, so we didn't particularly care one way or the other. At this point, I might say I was a regular Army man, and I had no intentions of getting out of the service. I really had no intentions of getting killed. I didn't even think about that, or getting wounded either. I was regular Army. I was going to put my 30 years in the Army. And I had no place really to call home. I was from Dallas, Texas. My mother and brother lived there, but there was no place really home for me except the Army. And wherever the battalions was, or wherever the battalion's colors were flying or stationed, that was home to me. I was just in the United States Army. And so we spent the day of June 5, 1944, and I kind of want to think it was a Saturday. I may be wrong, but I'd have to go way back on a calendar to look. But we spent that day sitting in Weymouth Harbor, looking at the girls on the beach and the other people through our field glasses, and just being miserable in general. We had either K rations or possibly C rations that day for dinner. I just can't remember. One thing about the Army, they tried to feed you 3 meals a day. It may not always have been the best, but we did get fed. So with the approaching of sundown, all of a sudden they fired up the motors on the boat, and we began to creep out of the harbor. And as I said, we spent most of the day that day doing gun drill, writing letters, shooting the breeze, or observing the beach and things like that. About close to sundown, they say they fired up the motors, and we slowly crept out of the harbor, and on the night of June 5, 1944, and formed up in a convoy again. We noticed right away that the water was not quite as choppy. It had calmed down quite a bit, and most people had mixed thoughts. Some of us still thought that this was just another dry run. Some of us began to think it was a real thing, and some of us didn't give a darn one way or the other. We were just wanting to get the thing on and get off this boat, because we had been on it something like 3 or 4 days now, and we were getting kind of tired of it. As we formed up in convoy and headed out, We could see in the moonlight or through the darkness the barrage balloons on top of some of the ships. And we could occasionally see and hear aircraft go over. And from the shapes of them, we knew that they were either bombers or airborne planes going over. And so we spent that night trying to sleep or huddled up around the gun. There were a number of infantrymen on the boat, and it was, in fact, as far as we were concerned, full capacity or overloaded with personnel. So that's why we kind of thought that this might be the real thing as we steamed along. The water would come over the bow of the ship and spray the gun and spray the men. So we were sitting with our slickers on and had stretched our pup tents up along the edge of the gun to try and ward off some of the water on our shelter halves of our pup tents, and tried to comfort each other the best we knew how. I was more or less thinking about a number of things, like being back in the States, or just different things that come across your mind, or what I might do to throw a party for my men when we got back to New York, or after the war, or maybe when we got in France. We kind of figured we were going to France, but wherever. I was thinking more about the sort of good times. Not once did I think about the boat getting sunk, or about getting killed, or even getting wounded. I just knew that we had a good gun crew, and on our boat was the number 3 gun and the number 4 gun, which was the 2nd platoon of B Battery. So we bounced along on the sea. We could see that there were hundreds of boats in and around us. In the back of us we had some warships, also in front of us. Little did we know that the invasion was on. We only knew the job that we were prepared to do, and that was to start firing on prearranged targets at approximately 11,000 yards out, or when our guns came in range of the beach, and fire down to a point where we would be either instructed or we were afraid of hitting friendly troops. But anyway, the night passed very slowly, and everybody had a very miserable night. Well, now the thing that shocked a bunch of dozing men fully awake, if you could call dozing between the water sprays and the what I call freezing weather, it was quite cold and everybody was shivering. I was thinking about how good a cup of hot coffee would go about then. Cigarettes were no problem. We could go down behind the shield of the gun and hide the flash of our cigarette lighters. But the thing that jogged us most was the big guns beginning to shoot. The big battleships and the cruisers and the heavy stuff had begun to shoot. As far as I could tell, we were still moving forward or towards the beach, or we might have been going in circles. All I know or remember for sure is the boat was moving. Where it was going, I did not know. I couldn't determine if the ships that were firing or were shooting straight ahead or from broadside or whatever. All I could see was some tremendous gun flashes, and I assumed they were coming from the heavy warships, the battleships, or heavy cruisers of the U.S. Navy. But as the light approached us and we could see the ships patrolling in front of us and letting loose with their guns. And it did turn out that we had been semi-zigzagging or going in a semi-circle. And I presume that was to have us dispersed enough if an E-boat or U-boat got in among us, they couldn't sink us like a bunch of sitting ducks. But anyway, still that was far from my mind. I was more or less determined that our gun would make it, that my crew would make it, and that I would make it. I just didn't have any other thoughts of failure. Well, as it began to get light enough to see, the officer in charge of our boat, Lieutenant Borop, began to rouse the men out and get the gun crew loaded, to get the ammunition standing by and get ready for our first fire mission. We had cranked the tubes of our howitzers up and pulled the covers off and cranked the tubes up to approximately our maximum range, which was leveling off just a little over 11,000 yards. And sure enough, as we, I guess you could call it, were maneuvering position, we had looked out and could see a long line of boats both right and left. It so happened that it was the 9 boats that carried the 62nd Armored Field Artillery Battalion and the 9 boats that carried the 58th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, our sister battalion. Our boat had 2 howitzers in the bow, or front. We had hooked 2 half tracks immediately behind the guns with cables, and directly behind them one had a quarter-ton truck and the other had a jeep tied to it. And our job, I guess you could call it, was when we went into the water, we had something like a 10 or 12 foot shroud over the back of the vehicle, which was the air intake. All the parts of the motor were waterproof. When the gun, where the gun could actually be submerged underwater and keep moving, and then we were to drag the half tracks and the other vehicles behind them on into shore. They were completely waterproof as far as the motor section was concerned, and everything else in them that was waterproofable was waterproof. The gun crew was standing by, and it was lots of noise going on with the big guns shooting up the front, and we couldn't even see the shore at that time. It was still another dry run, so we thought, or it seemed to us. It just didn't have no bearing whatsoever on our train of thought. So we leveled off at 11,000 yards, and we were loaded up and fired our first round. Then immediately the gun crew reloaded, and we sat there for the next gong on the wooden paddle on the tin pan in the back of us. The chief of section was looking, and he would holler fire immediately when the gong was hit. And it went on like this. We fired a number of rounds, and we probably covered maybe 3,000 or 4,000 yards. And it was more or less just like a picnic. There was nothing happening. We were doing all the shooting, and it was just routine to us. Then all of a sudden, the entire version or complexity of things changed. And I might say changed abruptly. All of a sudden, it was that old familiar sound of zing, swash, kind of sound that a shell makes when it hits the water. And we knew that we were back in the war. Those of us who had heard it before, and it had been a good while since we had heard a shell hit, but it is a kind of a sound that you never forget. It stays with you the rest of your life. All you have to do is, I could say right now, I could hear one, I would know exactly what was going on. Well, we all come alive and awake all of a sudden. It was a feeling of, well, I don't know how to explain fear, but it was something that, a feeling that went over you when you knew that your next breath could be your last one. And of course, we were continuing to do our job. The gun crews were busy, and we were beginning to get loaded and ready to fire, drop our elevation in 4 or 5 seconds, and we'd have that 25 or 26 seconds to wait for the ship, the LCT, to cover those 30 seconds worth of ground, where we could drop our 50 yards, for which we could fire again. But we began to size the situation up, or I did, and I came to the conclusion that we were being ranged in by at least a battery of 88 millimeter guns, or it could have been a stripped down battalion, or even some tanks up on the shore shooting at us. But we were receiving our first fire something in the neighborhood of 5,500 yards, or maybe 6,000 yards. That was just an approximate guess. But the 88 millimeter guns certainly had the range that we were coming into and were beginning to bracket us, and it's not exactly a good feeling. I could see a little later 2 or 3 of the 58 boats on our left getting hit, and I knew it was just a matter of time until they would be dropping them right down our throats. But we were there for a purpose, and we were staying on course and giving our 18 rounds every 30 seconds. The landing boats seemed to travel at an awful slow speed. These things seemed to, of course. I know everything was going on normal, but when you were being shot at, it makes things look a lot darker on your side than it did before when we were sitting there on the business end of the guns, putting them out on the other end, going into shore. Then things began to get confusing. We were running by, best I can remember, some bigger ships, and somebody said, "There's the battleship Texas, and there's the battleship New York, and there's the cruiser Augusta, and then here comes a big French cruiser and a French battleship." And I remember the guys hollering, "Get them tin cans out of the way. Let a good unit get through." And, you know, hollering things out like that, as long as you were doing something or acting, the morale seemed to stay up. When there was nothing to do, and I know those infantry boys on our boat and some of our drivers and men who were there to take care of the half-tracks and jeeps had nothing to do. But what I'm trying to say is, if you have nothing to do but just sit there, it was like waiting for the slaughter, if you want to use those terms. That's the feeling you had, just waiting to be hit. And us guys that were on the gun, at least we felt like we was doing something. We were shooting back, and that was the scheme of the whole thing. That as long as you were shooting, you felt like you were in the war. We approached on, and we kept firing our one round every 30 seconds. But we could glance up every now and then, and we could still hear and see the shells hitting. Some of them were going over, and they were definitely 88s. And I would think to myself, let me hold control here. Let me hold on to myself and not let the guy see how scared I am, or not let me lose control of the gun. That was one of my biggest fears, I guess, was being caught being afraid, if you want to put it that way. I was able to keep myself under control. I was shivering, and I think it was from the cold worse than it was being afraid. But I still had that feeling that you always got it, I guess, that it's not going to hit you, it's going to hit somebody else. And we just kept on approaching the beach, and we could look up or glance up and get a look at what was going on. And all of a sudden, the lieutenant put his wooden stick down and began to come up next to the guns. And he had put his stopwatch up. So I knew he didn't have to say anything. We had just run out of firing range. And I estimated that at that time that we were maybe somewhere in the range of possibly 2,000 yards to the beach, or maybe a little less. And the boat started to turn, and that was the hardest part. Because along about this time, we hadn't experienced it before, but we were getting 20 millimeter anti-aircraft fire right into the boat as we turned. I could hear the shells striking the boat because everybody at that particular time had their head down as low as they could get it, wishing that they could push right through the bottom of the boat, or that's the way I was. And as we turned, and there you had that helpless feeling of, I can't do nothing now. And as the boat was turning, we turned to the right. I remember that. And it seemed like the whole 62nd, all 9 boats, made a big swing to the right. Because there was either a destroyer or a cruiser coming along as we were making our turn. And I know that some of the boats, the little boats, had to swing way wide to miss him. But he was shooting his perhaps 6-inch guns, I couldn't say, maybe 6 or 8-inch guns. And they were broadsiding off. I later found out that it was the cruiser Augusta, and they were firing their 6 9-inch guns into the beach area. Well, what had happened is that the 58th had turned to the left and the 68th had turned to the right, and the infantry boats were coming in between us and heading for the beach. Big circle, and then come right back in behind the 16th Infantry and the ones we were supporting of the 1st Division, and land on Fox Red Beach at Omaha Beach. It seemed like that I remember one or two guys were wounded somewhere in the boat. I can't even remember if they were airmen or some of the others, but the 20-millimeter shells that exploded, some of them exploded in the inside of the boat. Of course, we were so busy trying to get down low and waiting to see what was going to happen. I just knew that it wasn't any of our crew, any of my crew anyway. When the boats turned and started out, we were followed right out by this bunch of 88s. And I can't remember any of our guns or of our boats getting hit. Of course, they were kind of joggling and bobbling in the water, so I imagine that they were a pretty hard target to hit. And the chances of being hit at that particular time seemed like that we would almost certainly be hit. But the chances were very slim of hitting us from maybe where those 88s were, maybe 4,000 yards away. But the 20 millimeters were still tracing us right on out, and they began to drop a few long-range mortars out among the boats, some heavy mortar stuff, I'd say from 80 millimeter and maybe even higher, possibly 120 millimeter. I just couldn't say. But it was a pretty good range for mortars anyway. Then it seemed like the boat was practically standing still. We were all having that urge like you do at a horse race to kind of shake your shoulders trying to get the horse to run faster. Well, that was the way we were probably trying to get this boat to go faster, or I felt myself doing it anyway. Well, at this time, it was approximately, I'd say, in the neighborhood of 7:30 or possibly getting close to 8 in the morning. I just couldn't say. I think that I looked at my watch as we were going back out, and it was getting close to 8:30 or 8:45. Anyway, a lot of things went through my mind as we were going out, and it seemed like we went maybe 3,000 or 4,000 yards back out, and then made our turn to come back in to follow the infantry in. Well, when we made our turn to come back in, I all of a sudden felt that I was real hungry. I was craving something to eat, but it wasn't what we had. My thoughts drifted back like in a flash, a few seconds. My thoughts went back to a bar and grill in El Paso, Texas, where when I was in the old horse cavalry down there, we used to patronize a lot. They served a taco, a tremendous big taco on a plate filled with lettuce and tomatoes, all for 10 cents. And you could get a beer back in those days, Southern Select or Falstaff, or some of those beers that are practically unheard of today, for 10 cents a bottle. And it was ice cold. And anyway, my thoughts went back to the California Bar and Grill on Santa Fe Street in El Paso, Texas, and there I was. I could imagine myself sitting there at the bar ordering a ice cold beer and a large Mexican taco, which was very tasty, and all for 20 cents. And there I was with maybe $200 in my pockets, and I couldn't even buy a 20-cent taco and beer. But that was the kind of things that I was thinking about that time. Now, as we come back in, I'm trying to remember here exactly the way I can visualize it. The infantry was still going ashore, and the assault joint signal engineer units were going in. And it didn't seem like to me that they were clearing the beach. Everything seemed like it was all bogged up there. All of a sudden, the boat slowed down almost a standstill, and the lieutenant hollered for the gun crews to come awake, that we may get a fire mission any minute, even on the beach, or even on the boat, or the minute we got on shore. But again, all of a sudden, I was awakened with this stream of, I want to say, white tracers. I think I looked up, seeing some white tracer bullets flying, and here come an airplane. In fact, it seemed more like 2 or 3 airplanes coming down the beach, and I think that the Navy ships were shooting at them. I remember seeing one boat, a long flat boat with a bunch of twin 40-millimeter Bofors on it, and I just glanced at it a couple of times. And there also was a rocket barge, which was discharging rockets off as we come up close enough to see. But I was trying to look up at the beach in between the 20mm cannon shells coming in and the mortar shells, and it seemed like that we were spared the artillery there for that particular moment. All of a sudden the boat started backing out, and we backed way out, and we could see the Navy shells from the ships hitting the beach. And I could not visualize why they were doing this, because our infantry was supposed to be on the beach. In fact, we were supposed to be on the beach, or to have men on the beach, and our guns were supposed to be on the beach by this time of the day, since that was the way we had been briefed. But we kept backing out, and it seemed like we backed and backed and backed for a long way. And of course our gun crew was just sitting there, and when you just sit there, things begin to drag, and it seemed like an eternity had gone by, but in reality the time was flying. The next run in, it was close to noon. Again, we followed the same procedure. When the 20mm shells started bouncing on the boat, on the front of the boat, we could hear them hitting and exploding. We backed out again. I was wondering why they didn't drop the ramps and let us go, because each time we hit it in, we had our motors revved up and had them ready to take off the boat, but they never would drop the ramp and let us off. Then the next time I realized, time-wise, it was about 1:30 or 2 o'clock, or in that vicinity, and it could have been maybe the third or fourth run in by then. I had lost all count. I just don't know. But we would back out and then head back in for the same reason or other. They'd back us out, and I believe it was maybe it had been the third time. We just kept going, and I could see the beach. We got nearer and nearer. The swooshing sound of the mortars were coming in pretty close to the boat, and I saw one boat on that last run in off to our left. I don't know whether it was one of ours or one of the 58s that got hit. It looked like it got hit close to the front, and just the front of the boat kind of shuddered and went down, and it just went out of sight. They were in water deeper than the boat, or deeper than 12 foot anyway, because the gun and the whole boat just disappeared. The gun on the boat were gone. Then we were huddled down in the gun just as close as we could get to it. We had kept our motors revved up, and again, this time, I was listening very close to the shells, because I knew if they opened the ramp to let us off, and those 20mm guns up on the beach would just spray us with 20mm shells. And I was trying to get in a position where I wouldn't get hit. I was behind the shield on our self-propelled gun. The motors were revved up, and I could hear this Navy lieutenant hollering to his crew what to do, and they had begun to drop the rear anchor. I could hear it when it went out, and I knew that we would go about 250 feet before they'd run out of anchor on the cable on the rear anchor. But all of a sudden the boat just shook and shuddered, and I thought, oh, we're hit. But it was what happened. The anchor chain had been dropped, and the boat was going forward, and it had run over a sandbar. Then we had run out of cable, and it was holding the boat back. The boat was trying to go forward, and the anchor was holding it, causing the boat to kind of shake and shudder. Then along about this time, I remember this naval lieutenant run madly around the boat, and I could hear him hollering and telling our lieutenant, get them damn things off my boat, get them damn things off my boat. And so I knew when they opened that ramp that we were going to get sprayed, but the ramp went down, and the motors were so revved up, and I was looking at the lieutenant standing in the passenger seat of the half track directly behind the gun, and his arm was up, and he looked like he was trying to make up his mind what to do, and all of a sudden his arm went forward, and I kicked the driver in the back of the head or on the helmet, and that meant for him to let the sticks go and let her roll, and off we went. The third section was on our left, and the fourth section was on the right, and I can vaguely remember seeing the third section gun moving and going in the air and falling off the front of the boat, dragging the vehicles behind it. And for some reason or other, we were just seconds behind him getting started, and then I heard a kind of a glub, glub, blubbing sound, and we went off into the water. Number 4 gun did. And the water was deeper than our air tank, and of course it was just immediately flooded. The thing I was thinking about right then was all the stuff we had lost. The Navy boys had given us 50 pounds of sugar, 25 or 30 pounds of coffee, and 40 or 50 cartons of cigarette, and we had all this stuff on our self-propelled gun, and they were all gone, and even the boat was off in the water, and we had lost all this stuff in our gun, our ammunition. And I even thought about the picture of Doreen Villiers. I remember that. There was a girl that sang when we were down in North Africa in 1943. She used to sing songs over BBC. Her name was Doreen Villiers, and she sang a request that was sent in by me and 2 of the other guys from down there in 1943. She sang this song and dedicated it to Joe, Jerry Lee, and the boys of Battery B. And we had sent her a V-mail letter requesting this, and then in turn she sent us a photograph, an 8x10 picture of herself from the waist up. And we had this picture taped to the gun carriage on the inside where all the guys could see it. Anyway, we lost the picture of Doreen Villiers and all our coffee and all our cigarettes. I didn't even have time to see where the other guys were at. I had my cartridge belt on, but didn't have it buckled up. And I had a carbine. I think I might have had it on my shoulder. I just don't know. But anyway, with all this stuff on, my thoughts was, with all this weight, I might drown. And when we hit the water, or when the water come inside the gun of our open top gun carriage, I knew we were more than 12 foot deep, or our shroud would have stuck out and let the motor breathe and keep running. So I began to think about drowning, so I threw off the rifle and the cartridge belt and used all my strength to get to the top. I still had my shoes and leggings on. We were wearing OD clothes. When I come up, all I could see was just a blur in front of me, and as my eyes cleared, I could see the guys trying to swim that way towards the beach. So I went that way too, and the next thing I knew, I was touching down on bottom, and I was standing in water about chin deep. It was just, I could just stand and keep my head out of the water, and I was trying to move forward, and the little waves were coming in and backing out, and they were just shoving me back as I walked in. Then my eyes focused on all the chaos that was going on up the beach, and I could hear the mortar rounds, possibly artillery rounds, hitting in the beach area. Then I could hear a few rifles or machine gun fire going on. So they had some big steel cross-looking things sticking out of the water. I think they were originally meant to stop tanks. I remember going up to one, under one, or up to one, and trying to stay behind that steel, and there were so many men crowding around trying to get behind this steel that I felt kind of guilty trying to stick behind something. So I thought, well, I could see the beach, and I could see a number of fellows lying on the beach, men and equipment, and I thought, if I could get across this beach of maybe 35 to 40 yards and there to the cliffs, and they were beginning to gather up under the cliffs then, the men were, and I knew if I could get up under that cliff that at least I'd be safe from small arm fire. or from the small arm fires coming down, and possibly from the mortars. So I finally inched my way up out of the water, and all of a sudden I realized how cold I was, and I was shaking at quite a speed, I guess you could call it. I didn't realize how scared I was or how cold I was getting, I guess. Anyway, I jumped up, started running, and as I run along, the first thing I picked up was a rifle. Then there was a guy laying on the beach, and he had 2 bandoliers of ammunition in his hand. So I took them out of his hand because he looked like he was dead. He was just laying there with his eyes open. He could have been in shock, I don't know, but I didn't stop. I kept running. And when I fell down beside the cliff, the first guy that I looked up into the face of was a fellow named Clarence E. Figgins from Fort Scott, Kansas, and he was one of my gun crew. I think I remember asking him, "Where's the rest of our crew?" And he just gave me a kind of a blank stare. He just didn't know or couldn't say anything. Then I began to realize how cold I was. I think the sun might have been shining. I can't remember exactly. I know a lot of smoke was around, and that could have been clouds. I just can't remember too clearly about that time, but I could still hear some machine gun fire here and there, and I could still hear the swoosh of the mortar rounds when they were hitting, but they were going further out to the seaward side from me, and I just sat there kind of numb, trying to realize what was going on, asking myself, just what in the hell are you doing in a place like this when I could be back in Fort Bliss and enjoying myself in the band, or anywhere other than this place? Why wasn't I back there instead of here? You know, you ask yourself, try to ask yourself that. But anyway, we seemed to go on through the day, or the rest of what was left of it. There wasn't just a little bit of the evening left. I remember as we were sitting there, or I was, either afraid to get up or too scared to get up or didn't want to get up. There was a colonel, I think he was a lieutenant colonel, coming down the beach. And he just nonchalantly walked up to where our group was and said, "I want somebody. Who's the non-commissioned officers around here?" I didn't say a word. I just said I didn't see any other non-commissioned officers making any move to get up. Then this fellow in my gun crew, if I ever wanted to strangle anybody, it was him right there. He said, "Here's my sergeant." This guy, this lieutenant colonel, he turned to me, said, "Are you a non-commissioned officer?" And I said, "Yes, I'm a sergeant in the artillery, and I'm a chief of section." He said, "Well, you start gathering these men up, since you're the only one here that's a sergeant. So you gather as many of these men as you can up," and pointed to a place down the beach and said, "Go down there and see Lieutenant so-and-so." I couldn't think of his name now to save my life, but anyway, I turned to him and I said, "I'm not an infantryman, I'm an artilleryman." And he said, "Well, I don't give a damn what you are. Have you ever had any infantry training?" I said, "Well, no, but I was in the cavalry once." He said, "That's good enough, you're in the infantry now." I found out later that one of our guns had also hit a mine coming in, and then what crew that was left from the mine, from the vehicle hit the mine, and the one that was left of our gun finally got up, and most of them joined the battery, and we had taken quite a number of casualties that day. I think we had 4 killed, I think 3 or 4 wounded. Well, I know now it was 4 killed and 6 slightly wounded, or 4 slightly wounded and 6 seriously wounded. Well, let me get this straight. I've got it written down here. We had 4 killed in action, we had 6 seriously wounded, and 4 slightly wounded from B battery. So anyway, the guys that were evacuated there, their places were taken by the gun crew members that had survived from the 2 guns. B battery had taken a tremendous beating since we were the first battery in. On that day, the next platoon from B battery didn't come in until nearly 6 o'clock. Anyway, I stayed with this bunch of infantry, engineers, and artillerymen, cavalrymen, and everybody that we could gather up there, and we formed up a kind of a provisional platoon and went inland to a little town called Collaville-sur-Moor, I think, or something like that. We made it in that night, but all night long, or up until 12 o'clock, even up until the next morning, we were still receiving sniper fire. They had quite a few snipers in the area, and although I had lost my gun and went through a very confusing day, I was still alive. I hadn't been wounded, I hadn't been killed, so I considered myself lucky. We helped the next morning, helped the grave restoration men gather up quite a number of dead fellows, put them in mattress covers, loaded them on a truck, and sent them back towards the rear. We were just doing whatever we could, or whatever we were told to do, but anyway, I had survived the D-Day landings in Normandy. My unit was semi-functional on the beach. They had got 4 guns from B Battery in that day, and 2 guns from A Battery had come in that day and formed up a provisional battery. And they were in firing position some 500 or 600 yards off the beach by the first night. That first night I was slightly ahead of them by maybe 1,500 or 2,000 yards with this bunch of stragglers. And all we did was just set up a perimeter behind the American infantry companies in case of breakthrough. And I think we must have had probably 2 or 3 companies of our infantry out ahead of us, scattered out. Roughly that's about what I remember of D-Day on June 6, 1944. We had quite a bunch of trouble start the next day and the next, but that's a different story. But that was what carried me from the morning of June 6, 1944 until June 6, midnight, and that's just about what we did. We strung up some barbed wire and put some tin cans on it and dug ourselves in and with foxholes the best we could for our own protection, you might say. So I hope that this has contributed something to what you were looking for from the morning. I think starting around 5 o'clock in the morning until midnight, June the 6th, and along about this time I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever get any sleep again.